The hero is giving their big speech, the one about hope, about justice, about fighting for what's right. The music swells, the other characters look moved, and somewhere in the audience, maybe in your living room, maybe in a cinema, someone is sitting there quietly thinking, I really hope the villain wins this one. Not because they want real-world harm, not because they're secretly plotting anything, just because the villain is, somehow, more interesting, more honest, more fully alive on screen than the person we're apparently supposed to be cheering for. The villain has better lines, better style, a more coherent worldview, and frankly, a more compelling reason to get out of bed in the morning. And when they inevitably lose in the final act, because they almost always lose, there's a specific, private disappointment that you maybe don't mention out loud because it seems like the kind of thing that requires some explaining. We tend to treat villain rooting as a guilty pleasure, a slightly embarrassing quirk to be laughed off. At most, a sign of good taste in cinema, because yes, the villain usually is better written. But the psychology underneath this preference is so much more revealing than mere aesthetic appreciation. What happens in your brain when you root for the villain tells you something real and important about who you are, and it's almost certainly not what you'd expect. Start with something called narrative transportation theory. When we engage with a story, a film, a book, a series, we don't just observe it from a distance, we enter it. The brain suspends its normal reality monitoring and allows itself to be partially absorbed into the fictional world. Characters become real enough for emotional investment. Outcomes feel genuinely high stakes. And the character we align with most closely becomes, temporarily, a kind of proxy self. We experience the story partly through them, partly as them. Now here's the question. What determines which character you align with? The standard answer is the protagonist. The hero is the focal point, the perspective anchor, the one the camera follows most. And for many viewers, that default alignment holds. But for a significant portion of people, something more complex is happening. They're scanning the entire character landscape and attaching not to the assigned hero, but to whoever feels most psychologically resonant, most honest, most real. And sometimes, often, that character is wearing the villain's coat. Think about what villains actually represent in storytelling. At their most interesting, they're not simply evil for evil's sake. They're characters who looked at the same world as the hero and drew entirely different conclusions. Characters who experienced real damage, real injustice, real loss, and responded to it without the convenient moral scaffolding the hero somehow always seems to have access to. Characters who want something badly enough to pursue it without apology, without compromise, without the constant reassurance seeking that heroes so often perform. Magneto watched his family die in a concentration camp and decided that the oppressed cannot trust their oppressors to eventually do the right thing. Thanos looked at finite resources and infinite consumption and concluded that the math was eventually going to win. Killmonger grew up in a system specifically designed to exclude him and decided that waiting politely for change was a luxury he couldn't afford. These are not random evil. These are characters with coherent, internally consistent worldviews forged in genuine pain. You might disagree with their conclusions, but you can follow the logic. And following the logic is, in the brain's experience, a form of intimacy. Research in narrative psychology has found that readers and viewers form the strongest parasocial connections not with morally perfect characters, but with morally complex ones. Characters who contain contradictions, who have understandable motives for questionable actions, who feel like more complete human beings than the sanitized protagonists they're typically contrasted with. Complexity reads as truth, and the brain trusts truth, even when it's uncomfortable. There's also something happening with what psychologists call moral disengagement in fiction, a concept that deserves more attention than it gets. In ordinary life, your moral operating system is running constantly. You evaluate actions against your values, you feel guilt and empathy and responsibility, you police your own impulses in ways that are mostly unconscious but always present. Fiction creates a space where that operating system can be partially suspended. You can follow a character into territory you'd never endorse in reality: violence, manipulation, ruthlessness, the pure pursuit of power, and experience it without real-world consequence. The brain knows it's a story. The safety rails are up. And in that safe space, something gets to breathe that doesn't usually get to breathe. For many villain rooters, the appeal is precisely this. The villain is living by rules they can't apply in their own life. The villain doesn't apologize. The villain doesn't shrink. The villain doesn't modulate their ambition to make other people comfortable. The villain identifies what they want and moves toward it with a directness that ordinary social life punishes severely. And watching that, cheering for that, is a form of vicarious experience. A safe, fictional rehearsal of a mode of being that the real world has made too costly to actually adopt. This is, when you look at it clearly, not disturbing. It's actually quite healthy. The ability to imaginatively inhabit perspectives very different from your own, including morally transgressive ones, is associated with higher empathy, higher cognitive flexibility, and greater creative capacity. The people who can follow a villain's logic all the way to its conclusion without losing their own moral footing are often the most sophisticated ethical thinkers in the room. They understand the other side not as abstract evil, but as a coherent human position. That's not moral confusion, that's moral depth. There's a personality dimension here too. Research on what's called need for cognition, the degree to which a person enjoys and is motivated by effortful thinking, consistently predicts preferences for complex, morally ambiguous narratives over straightforward, heroic ones. People who find simple good versus evil stories intellectually unsatisfying tend to be people who are more comfortable sitting with contradictions, who find ambiguity interesting rather than threatening, who want their entertainment to ask something of them rather than simply confirm what they already believe. Villains, at their best, ask a lot. They pose uncomfortable questions. They hold up a mirror to systems and assumptions that heroes are usually designed to protect. And a mind that enjoys hard questions will almost always find the mirror more interesting than the myth. There's also the matter of authenticity. One of the most consistent findings in character preference research is that audiences respond powerfully to characters who know what they want. Not characters who are good, characters who are clear. The hero's journey is often a journey toward purpose, which means the hero spends a significant portion of the narrative uncertain, reactive, discovering themselves. The villain, meanwhile, arrived with clarity. They knew their goal before the opening credits. They have a plan. They're executing it. And in a world where most of us feel perpetually unclear about what we're doing and why, that certainty is quietly, privately magnetic. There's also something worth naming about justice, or the failure of it. A particular subset of villain rooters are people who have, in their real lives, experienced systems that didn't work the way they were supposed to, institutions that failed them, rules that turned out to protect the powerful rather than the vulnerable, situations where doing the right thing led to bad outcomes, and where the person who played by the rules got taken apart by the person who didn't. For these viewers, the hero's faith in existing systems can feel not inspiring but naive, almost insulting. And the villain, who has no such faith and operates accordingly, resonates not as a fantasy but as a recognition, as someone who finally said out loud what this viewer already knows. This doesn't make them cynical, it makes them experienced, and there's a difference. Here's the reframe I want to leave you with. Rooting for the villain isn't a sign that your moral compass is broken. It's a sign that your moral imagination is working. You're not accepting the story's assigned allegiances without examination. You're doing the more interesting cognitive work of asking, why does this character want what they want? Is their logic coherent? What does their existence reveal about the world the hero is trying to protect? And sometimes the answer to that last question is uncomfortable enough that you find yourself hoping the system they're attacking loses, even as you'd never endorse the attack itself. The villain, at their best, is a question the story is asking, and the people who root for them are the ones paying close enough attention to hear it. Tell me in the comments, who's your villain? The one you shouldn't have been rooting for but absolutely were. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology of why we respond to fiction the way we do, and what it reveals about who we actually are, stick around. There's a lot more to talk about.